Alles klar. Willst du schon Jackett rausziehen? Also wie und den Jackett durch. Das war nicht so baumeln.
Ja. Wie viele sind das heute jetzt?
Heute sind 3 die begrüßen, die werden mit verkabelt und dann die Keynote-Speakerin macht auch ein Headset. Genau.
Ja, okay.
Was können wir das Kabel auch irgendwie versorgen, dass es nicht so runterbauen kann?
Ja.
Ich kann einen Stuhl setzen und verhält sich und
Ja, also das geht so.
Das geht sehr gut.
Okay.
Schnell.
Okay, und die sitzen?
Die Keynote-Speakerin ist im Rollstuhl, die kommt hier hoch, genau.
Ja.
Also diesen Stuhl würde ich auch noch beiseite stellen.
Ja.
Genau.
Okay. Sind die Leute auch schon da? Hast du gesehen? Ja. Das ist gerade das da an. Wenn man unter dem Schock geht, oder? Ja, ich glaube, den Bambel nicht.
Sehr gut. Nee. Das kann man sagen. Sorry, Dave. Kennst du den Schluss von 2001 Space Odyssey?
Und was?
Stanley Kubrick, sagt ihr das etwas?
Ja.
Ja. Er hat einen Film gemacht, der heißt ja, schau das. 2001 Space Odyssey. Of course. Und dort, wenn er den Computer sagt, I'm sorry, Dave.
Hell.
Ja, genau.
Hell.
Ja.
Sorry,
Dave. Da muss ich jetzt nicht sagen, aber so habe ich wenigstens ein Essen.
Und das ist gut.
Sollen wir die Keynote-Speakerin auch schon verkabeln? Um 16:30 Uhr.
Das
Da ist keine Pause, also ich würde
ja,
sie an.
Ja, dann machen wir das. Ja, darf ich bitte noch schnell? Ja.
Frei haben.
Geht das so?
Ja, mach weiter, was ist das? Steckst du auf, stand du ab, dann ist es klar. Jetzt sind wir noch Fragen.
Nee, das ist okay. Zwickt nicht. Weil das yes.
So, und wenn das jetzt ich habe meins da abgelegt.
Ich habe schon gesehen, ja. Ich lege einen Ton von 1 und fange ich an, mit 1 zu lesen.
Das können wir auch.
Das haben wir rein.
Das brauchen wir heute nicht, das brauchen wir morgen.
Okay.
Genau, oder wir können sagen.
Weißt du, wie will ich?
Ja, das
Ja, und dann macht es Werbung. Genau. Ja, dann sag ich.
entweder so oder
Oder
aber wenn es gleich ist, dann ist es nicht.
Ja, ja.
Ich weiß
nein, das ist fast viel, dass das immer weiß, also wenn ich so eine ruhige ja.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Guten Abend, bonsoir. I have to disappoint those who do understand only English. We have a rather young tradition that everyone speaks in his or her language. And since we have a mixture of at least 3 or 4 languages here, and I say this only in English for the ones who will not understand what I say afterwards in German, we will speak or present or open this conference in German, English, and Italian. I'm the first one to welcome you, and I will do in German, so I switch now to German. But you are very welcome to ask me what in the world was I saying, and I will tell you a brief summary afterwards. And I may skip here and there into some English terms, so you don't get lost completely. Guten Abend, meine sehr verehrten Damen und Herren, liebe Kolleginnen und Kollegen, und willkommen in dieser großen Schweizer Kunsthochschule, der Zürcher Hochschule der Künste, in diesem Toni-Areal. Diese Schule hat über 2000 Studierende, über 100 Professorinnen und Professoren, überhaupt über 600 Dozierende und ein Budget, ein jährliches Budget von über 100 Millionen Franken. Groß, lauter Superlativen, ich könnte noch weitermachen. Aber das wäre nicht ganz das, was wir heute besprechen wollen. Denn bei all diesen Superlativen habe ich die letzten Wochen versucht herauszufinden, wie viele Professorinnen und Professorinnen mit körperlicher oder geistiger Bildung wir haben, wie viele Studierenden mit irgendwelcher Art von Bildung wir haben und überhaupt wie viele Dozierenden wir haben. Und zum einen wurde mir von offizieller Seite gesagt, es gibt keine Zahlen, weil man die aus guten Gründen, auch aus Datenschutzgründen, nicht statistisch erfassen will. Und zum anderen sind die eigentlichen Bemühungen, Menschen, die sonst vielleicht den Zugang verwehrt sehen würden, erst in den letzten Jahren hier eingeführt worden. Tatsächlich ist in den 5 Jahren, und 5 Jahre sind wir jetzt in diesem Toni-Areal, eine ganze Reihe von Unternehmen haben stattgefunden, um, ich zitiere, taktilvisuelle Leitlinien und Beschriftungen einzuführen, automatisierte Türen, induktive Höranlagen, Bodenmarkierung, optischer Aufprallschutz auf den Glasflächen und die legendäre Treppe, legendär, weil sie niemand im eigentlich dafür architektonisch gedachten Rhythmus gehen kann. Die haben Sie vielleicht gesehen, die Treppe vor dem Hauptgebäude, die Haupttreppe, die ist gerade erst letztes Jahr zu einem Drittel in eine Rampe verwandelt worden. Man darf also jetzt, auch wenn der Lift mal nicht funktioniert, auf diese Rampe hoch oder runter rollen. So, diesen Sommer noch folgt die taktile Beschriftung sämtlicher Hörsäle und Seminarräume. Menschen mit Seh-, Mobilitäts- und Hörbehinderungen finden sich zunehmend zurecht bei uns. Aber damit haben die den Zugang in die Räumlichkeiten. Wie sieht es mit dem Zugang auf die Bühnen, Tanzflächen, Leinwände und Orchesterbühnen aus? Ich kenne viele Professorinnen und Professoren, glauben Sie mir, ich bin seit 17 Jahren hier, und viele mit exzellenten Abilities. Ich kenne keinen einzigen Kollegen mit Disabilities. Und die wunderbare Welt der Kunst und deren Ausbildung, wo gerne die Grenzen zwischen Enabling und Disabling befragt, Einverleibungen des Nicht-Genormten erprobt und die Bühnen unserer nicht selbstverständlichen Alltäglichkeiten zur Schau gestellt und diskutiert und debattiert werden. Auf diesem Parkett unserer künstlerischen Entwicklungen und unserer Eitelkeiten ist Disability nach wie vor eine Seltenheit. Hier, wie im Rest unserer gepeitschten Welt, wird mentale, physische Effizienz als abruf- und einsetzbar vorausgesetzt. Warum eigentlich? Welche Ideale oder auch nur Gewohnheiten schreiben dies vor? Und warum jagt es wiederum nicht nur mir Tränen der Rührung und Ergriffenheit in die Augen, wenn ich bei einer Aufführung die Unforeseen Abilities, die Aufführung, die wir alle heute um 18 Uhr hier in der Kaskadenhalle sehen werden, wenn ich den Generalprobe, ich gestern verfolgen durfte, wenn man die sieht, warum berührt mich das so? Wenn unter anderem unterschiedlich konditionierte Körper eben gemeinsam tanzen, sich spiegeln, eine Kette oder einen Kreis bilden und ja, sich ergänzen und sich wechselseitig enablen. Vielleicht waren es solche und ähnliche Fragen, die Yvonne Schmidt schon während ihrer Doktorarbeit dazu trieben, das Thema in angemessener Größe beim Schweizerischen Nationalfonds als Forschungsprojekt zu beantragen. Ja, die Technik, aber wir geben nicht auf. Beim Schweizerischen Nationalfonds ein Projekt zu Disability. Oh, hieß es da aus Bundesbern. So viel Geld für so ein Thema. Ist das nicht, Zitat, viel zu groß, zu ambitioniert, zu komplex, mit viel zu vielen Partnern und zu wenig Koordination? Ende des Zitats. Und indeed, danke. Mit 2 Fachhochschulen und 2 Universitäten, mit einem Dutzend Partnern im In- und Ausland, mit einer sowohl theoretischen Aufarbeitung der aktuellen Debatten, aber auch einer im Zentrum der Untersuchung stehenden praktischen Erprobung von Theater und Tanz von und mit Menschen mit Behinderung. Das war groß geplant und stieß bei den Förderinstanzen auf entsprechend große Skepsis. Fragen nach der Übertragbarkeit, dem Zeitrahmen, der Validität der Videoethnografie, Präzision von Physical Theatre als Methode und schließlich müssen sowieso die kantonale Ethikkommission in die Planung einbezogen werden und überhaupt das Thema, Zitat, welche Rolle das Behindertentheater in der Schweizer Gesellschaft generell spielt, Zitat Ende, wäre grundsätzlich zu befragen. Wir landeten mit dem ersten Antrag in der untersten Förderpriorität quasi chancenlos für dieses Don't Try Again. Das war 2014, als die Schule in dieses Gebäude gezogen ist, vor 5 Jahren. Aber wir haben nicht aufgegeben, wir haben es überarbeitet, sind also die Bücher, haben all die Kriterien ernst genommen und tatsächlich beim zweiten Antrag, beim zweiten Mal hat es geklappt. Der Schweizerische Nationalfonds hat sehr großzügig das Projekt unterstützt. 2015 startete Disability on Stage und schnell folgten Präsentationen an internationalen Konferenzen, Tagungen, Kongressen in Coventry, Berlin, Hamburg, Rovereto, das Festival für zeitgenössischen Tanz in Italien, in Frankfurt, Köln, Gießen, aber 2017 auch am Schweizer Theatertreffen in Lugano, dann in Genf und nicht zuletzt in Chicago, Montreal, Santiago de Chile, Stockholm, Aberystwyth, Wales und in Sao Paulo bei der IFTR-Konferenz. Immer geleitet oder begleitet von Yvonne Schmidt und oder Sarah Marinucci, den ich schon jetzt für diesen unerhörten, zuweilen maßlosen Einsatz danken möchte. Und vielleicht mache ich hier ein etwas ungewohntes Aha und bitte Sie um einen kurzen, völlig unzeitgemäßen Applaus, weil die 2 haben die 4 Jahre. The applause needed to say this was for Yvonne and Sarah, who did work incredibly hard in this incredibly huge conference, but in those 5 years to make this come through, this research project. So let me switch back to Switzerland. I'll tell you everything I didn't tell in German afterwards in English. And also the things I did say. Also, im Hintergrund sehen Sie ein paar weitere Namen, die unmittelbar beteiligt waren, alle unmittelbar beteiligt. Jetzt klappt's. Und zum Teil auch heute anwesend sind, über die wir die nächsten Tage auch noch mehr hören werden. 2016, ich gehe jetzt ganz kurz zum Ablauf des Projektes, des Forschungsprojektes. 2016 die zentrale Phase 3 zu Freie Republik Hora, Proben für die Regiearbeiten, gefolgt von diesem praktischen Bühnenlabor mit einer öffentlichen Aufführung an der Accademia Teatro Dimitri in Verso. 2017 ein zweites Bühnenlabor zusammen mit den Studierenden des Bachelor Contemporary Art hier an der ZHWK und Performern von Beweggrund sowie Teatro Danzabile. Ein weiteres Ergebnis werden wir nachher sehen. Dann das Interrat-Symposium zum Thema künstlerische Praxis von, über, mit und für Menschen mit Behinderung im Sommer 2017 und die Präsentationen beider Labore an Festivals in Lugano, Basel, Bern und Zürich. Did you read them all? Make it once more. Ja, viele Beteiligte. Disability on Stage ist ein großes Projekt und es wird sich auch nicht klein reden lassen. Sehr umfassend, sehr ambitioniert, vielseitig, anspruchsvoll, vielsprachig. Wir werden es auch an diesen 2 Tagen an unseren eigenen Schwierigkeiten merken. Schwierigkeiten, darüber zu reden, herauszufinden, worüber reden wir genau, Erkenntnisse und Wahrnehmungen auszutauschen. Heute und morgen in Vorträgen, Workshops und Diskussionen eine einheitliche Sprache zu finden und vielleicht so etwas wie ein Wissenskörper zu bilden. Wir werden wahrscheinlich zuerst auf unsere Unfähigkeit, unser aller Kommunikationsbehinderung stoßen. Wer kennt sie nicht? Die Grenzen der eigenen Hinderung. Aber was hält uns davon ab, es zu versuchen? Wo fängt Ability an, auch jene des Beschreibens und miteinander Redens und Reflektierens? Denn chancenlos, wie es zu Beginn des Projektes schien, ist nichts mehr. Auch nicht, dass sich eine Bewerberin, geistig oder körperlich behindert, um einen Studienplatz oder sogar einen Lehrstuhl an dieser Schule bewirbt. Sind es doch am Ende die Studiengänge selbst, die von einer Inklusion profitieren. Der Diskurs mit Künstlerinnen und Künstlern sollte nicht durch stereotype Traditionen, durch Regeln und Gewohnheiten verhindert werden. Und das kann sich ändern, so wie die Rampe, wenn auch letztes Jahr erst umgebaut wurde. Wir sind zuversichtlich, dass künftig Künstlerinnen und Künstler aller Disziplinen, mit oder ohne Behinderung aller Art, nicht nur an dieser und vergleichbaren Ausbildungsstätten ihre eigenen Werte, ihre eigene immersive Lehren etablieren und ihre eigenen grenzfreien Arbeitsräume besetzen werden. Die Notwendigkeit, die Zonen unserer Verletzlichkeit zu erleben, die Grenzen der eigenen Fähigkeit zu beschreiten, auch und gerade da, wo die Offenlegung der Abilities unumgänglich wird, all das bringt Künstler erst dazu, sich ihrer ganz persönlichen Disposition und ihrer eigenen Schwere der Wahrnehmung und des Ausdrucks zu stellen. Das heutige Symposium eröffnet eine Abschlussphase einer langen Forschungsarbeit, deren großzügige Unterstützung durch den Nationalfonds vorerst endet, die aber in ihrer Wirkung und wegweisenden Grenzauslotungen noch Jahre und hoffentlich ewig dauern wird. Die thematische Fokussierung auf Darstellende mit Behinderung war eine bisher kaum untersuchte Theaterpraxis. Inzwischen hat sie sich schon in unserem Curriculum des Bachelor Contemporary Art eingefunden, und zwar wiederkehrend fest im Curriculum verankert. Ich komme schon zum Schluss und möchte, bevor ich Sie für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit, especially the ones who didn't understand the word, bedanke, gleich übergeben und dann können wir zweimal, ohne zu deuten, in einmal klatschen und das Wort übergeben an Paola Gilardi. Wahrscheinlich hatten Sie nicht die Gelegenheit, auf der langen Liste zu sehen, wer was und wie viele Beteiligungen da waren. Eine ganz wichtige Person, nicht nur für das Forschungsprojekt, sondern gerade auch und insbesondere für dieses Symposium, die mit ihrem Einsatz und mit, man muss es sagen, auch, das ist wichtig, Geld aus der SGTK diese Tage unterstützt hat, ist Paola Gilardi. Und ich übergebe deswegen ihr das Wort. Bitte Sie, Paola, herzlich mit einem italienischen Applaus zu begrüßen und bedanke mich für die Aufmerksamkeit.
Grazie mille Anton e ringrazio veramente molto l'IPF e la ZDK per la perfetta organizzazione di questo simposio e per l'accoglienza in questo bellissimo edificio, tra l'altro, anche se in passato qui si producevano yogurt e non arte. Also, parlo un po' italiano, un po' tedesco. Auch ich begrüße Sie alle ganz herzlich im Namen der Schweizerischen Gesellschaft für Theaterkultur. die ich seit letztem Jahr mit Yvonne Schmidt leite. A special welcome to our keynote speaker, Carrie Sandal, and to all the international guests. Und als großer ORA-Fan begrüße ich ganz speziell alle Ensemble-Mitglieder, die bei diesem Symposium mitmachen werden. E naturalmente, siccome sono ticinese, è un piacere particolare dare il benvenuto anche al Teatro Danzabile, alle ricercatrici e ai ricercatori dell'Accademia Teatro Dimitri e a tutti gli ospiti italofoni. Per cominciare ringrazio davvero di cuore Yvonne Schmidt, Sara Marinucci, Anton Rey e tutte le persone coinvolte nell'organizzazione del simposio e anche nell'importante progetto Disability on Stage. Großen Dank gebührt auch der Schweizerischen Akademie der Geisteswissenschaften, SAGW, für die großzügige Unterstützung. Als Mitgliedgesellschaft der SAGW sind wir von der Schweizerischen Gesellschaft für Theaterkultur, also können wir Mittel beantragen und diese Mittel erlauben uns eben oder ermöglichen uns eben Tagungen wie diese, so große Tagungen, internationale Tagungen wie diese oder mehrsprachige Publikationen herauszugeben. Mit unseren Tätigkeiten verfolgen wir zwei Hauptziele. Einerseits das Schweizer Theaterschaffen in seiner Vielfalt zu erforschen und zu dokumentieren und andererseits die Vernetzung und den Dialog zwischen Forschenden, Theaterschaffenden und dem interessierten Publikum aus allen Sprachregionen der Schweiz und auch über die Landesgrenzen hinweg zu fördern. Und deshalb ist für uns, wie bei diesem Symposium, die Zusammenarbeit mit Universitäten, Hochschulen und anderen Fachinstitutionen sowie auch mit Künstlerinnen und Künstlern wirklich von zentraler Bedeutung. Und auch Sie alle können unsere Tätigkeiten unterstützen oder aktiv mitwirken, indem Sie unserer Theatergesellschaft beitreten. Später am Büchertisch sind Flyer mit allen Informationen, also Sie können auf unsere Webseite www.mimos.ch oder Sie können auch Yvonne und mich ansprechen. Genug zur Werbung. Also es freut mich wirklich sehr, dass dieses Symposium den wichtigen Beitrag von Tanz- und Theaterschaffenden mit Behinderung in der Schweizer Theaterlandschaft und international in den Fokus rückt. Den Produktionen von und mit Darstellerinnen und Darstellern mit Behinderung genießen derzeit wirklich große Aufmerksamkeit und zwar auf höchster Ebene. Ein Beweis für die Qualität und die Wertschätzung ihrer Arbeit ist zum Beispiel die Verleihung 2016 des Schweizer Grand Prix Theater an Reinhard Link, also der höchsten Theaterauszeichnung des Landes, an das Theater Hora. E colgo l'occasione per ringraziare sentitamente l'Ufficio Federale della Cultura e in particolare la responsabile del settore danza e teatro, Claudia Rosini, che oggi è presente in sala e con cui abbiamo veramente una bellissima Kollaboration. Wir von der SGTK sind wirklich sehr glücklich, dass der von uns 1957 ins Leben gerufene Hans Reinhard Link seit 2014 fester Bestandteil der Schweizer Theaterpreise des Bundes ist und das Schweizer Grand Prix Theater an Reinhard Link seinen Stellenwert als höchster Theaterauszeichnung des Landes beibehalten konnte und durch eine schöne Preissumme sogar wirklich aufgewertet wurde. Und wir freuen uns auch sehr, dass wir auch trotzdem an der Verleihung noch beteiligt sind, indem wir wie bisher einen goldenen Ring überreichen können. Und da ist immer maßgeschneidert. Nun, bei Theater Hora gab es ein bisschen ein Problem und wir mussten entscheiden. Und Hora hat sich gewünscht, einen Ring wirklich fertigen zu lassen, das wirklich allen Ensemblemitgliedern passt. So kann jeder das mal anziehen. Das ist sehr schön. Und die SGTK widmet zudem jedes Jahr den jeweiligen Trägerinnen und Trägern des Schweizer Grand Prix Theaters Reinhard Links einen Band ihrer Reihe Mimos, Schweizer Theaterjahrbuch. Und auch diese Publikationsreihe verdanken wir der großzügigen Unterstützung des Bundesamts für Kultur. Das wäre sonst wirklich nicht möglich, diese Bücher mehrsprachig zu gestalten. Der Mimos-Band, ich habe eins dabei, habe ich auch vergessen. Die Bücher sind, also das Hora-Buch wird auch dann am Büchertisch. Ihr könnt darin stöbern, ihr könnt es kaufen, so ein wirklich Spezialpreis von 10 Franken. Das Schöne ist, es enthält 15 Beiträge von Forscherinnen und Forschern aus dem In- und Ausland, oder es gibt auch Interviews mit Hora-Leitern, oder es gibt auch Interviews oder Beiträge von Weggefährten, darunter zum Beispiel vom Regisseur Milo Rau. Und unsere Bücher sind immer viersprachig. Also die Beiträge sind auf Deutsch, Italienisch, Französisch oder Englisch, und es gibt dann auch die entsprechenden Übersetzungen. So, das ist wirklich uns ein Anliegen, diesen Dialog zu fördern. Ich liebe Congialetto, eine Tedesco-Gruppe. Eine letzte Sache, wenn Sie sich auch für die Geschichte des Hans-Reinhard-Rings und auch vielleicht der Schweizerischen Gesellschaft für Theaterkultur interessieren, die 2017 ihr 90-jähriges Bestehen feierte, können Sie dann am Büchertisch auch unsere Jubiläumspublikation erwerben. Die ist auch dreisprachig: Italienisch, Deutsch und Französisch. Da fehlt das Englisch, aber es ist mehr so eine nationale Sache. Und da gibt es auch Beiträge zum Beispiel von Sara Marinucci und von Denis Quadri von der Accademia Teatro Dimitri. Sara ist natürlich vom IPF. So, ora passo, io concludo qui e passo volentieri la parola alla mia collega, che è anche co-presidente della STK, Yvonne Schmidt, che ringrazio veramente di cuore per tutto il suo grande lavoro, und ich wünsche Ihnen allen eine anregende Tagung. Grazie mille.
Mein Vortrag hat Intima mitgenommen. Nein, wo ist der denn?
Das war das.
Okay. Ja, hello everybody. Einen schönen Nachmittag. Ciao a tutti. A warm welcome from my side to the final symposium of the Disability on Stage project. I'm going to talk in English, or maybe I will switch and say something in German in between. So thank you first, Paola, for the greeting on behalf of the Swiss Association for Theatre Studies. I'm very happy about our collaboration that fosters the exchange between theatre research and artistic practice, as well as between different language regions in Switzerland. Vielen herzlichen Dank. This symposium is maybe not the end, but another stopover on our journey that started already in winter 2013 or even earlier. After the performance Disabled Theatre by Theater Hora and Jerome Bell in 2012, and its consequences in the field of performance and disability in Switzerland, the field turned from a niche area into a highly topical subject of theatre practice and research. 20 years after its founding, the Theater Hora Ensemble became an internationally recognized touring company and received, as Paola already said, the most important theatre prize in Switzerland, the Swiss Grand Prix Theater Hans Reinhard Ring in 2016. Having said that, as a researcher and lecturer at Switzerland's largest art school that runs actor and dance training programs, I noticed that disability is still not an issue at all within the training programs. There is a vibrant scene of performing artists with disabilities in all of Switzerland's language regions. We have heard of Teatro Danzabile from the Ticino or Theater Hora, but also the Beweggrund in Bern, for example, or Dansabile in Geneva. But, and there are a lot of festivals under the umbrella of Microcultural Percentage Integrat, and I'm very glad that Isabella Spirig is here tonight as well. And yeah, these festivals and companies promote and celebrate dance and theater with and by artists with disabilities. But the disparity between the great success of artists with disabilities in theater and dance and the exclusion of people with disabilities at art schools prompted me to initiate the Swiss National Science Foundation project Disability on Stage at the Zurich University of the Arts. It was submitted in 2014 and launched in September 2015. In a network of 4 universities, theater and dance companies, and festivals in the different language regions, we started to investigate interdisciplinary theater and dance and disability in the Swiss context. The overall aim was, quote, to encourage the discourse of disability at art schools and universities and to transfer the resulting findings into practice. To which extent has the success of disabled theater actually led to a re-evaluation of the theater and dance work of disabled artists? Is the sub-project of the PhD project of my colleague Sarah Marinucci at the University of Bern. And if performers of Theater Rora now perform at the Schauspielhaus Zürich, where are the cognitively disabled directors or stage designers, dramaturgs, etc., is the topic of our sub-project at the Zurich University of the Arts in collaboration with the video ethnographers at the University of Basel. The Practice as Research study at the Accademia Teatro Dimitri Supsi in Veršu investigates what implications does this development have for theater and dance education in Switzerland, particularly in physical theater settings. In order to transfer the findings into a performer training context, we initiated the so-called Stage Lab or Bühnenlabor in the course of the project, supported by the Federal Office for the Equality of Persons with Disabilities. 2 model collaborations promoted the participation of people with disabilities in educational dance and theater training programs. The master degree in physical theater at Accademia Teatro Dimitri in Veršu in collaboration with the dance theater company Teatro Danzabile from the Ticino. And the bachelor's degree in contemporary dance at Zurich University of the Arts collaborated with Beweggrund in Bern and Teatro Danzabile in the Ticino. Kick-off workshops, colloquia, and several preparatory and evaluation meetings provided opportunities for critical reflection and exchange between different stakeholders from theater and dance practices and art schools as well as arts universities. The aims of these stage labs were as follows. First, raising awareness for disability within the art schools and universities in terms of students and teaching staff, but also infrastructures such as facility management, etc. Second, examining the potential and issues regarding the embedding of the collaboration between dancers with or without disabilities and performers in the curriculum. And last but not least, presenting the work process along with public discussions and audience discussions at festivals. As a highlight, the performances were shown in summer 2017 at various festivals in Switzerland under the umbrella of Intec Art by Micro Culture Percentage, accompanied by public discussions and podiums. Tonight, you will have the chance to see a tryout performance of the second edition of the so-called Stage Lab that has, as a result of our research project, become part of the curriculum of the BA program in contemporary dance at ZHDK. The students and dancers have been working here in the dance studio under the direction of Emanuel Rosenberg for the last few weeks, and I'm very excited to see the performance, which will go on tour again in spring. At this point, I would like to express my sincere thanks to all of those involved in the project over the past 4 years. First of all, I would like to thank Anton Rai and the Institute for the Performing Arts and Film for the opportunity to conduct the project and for the continued support. I would also like to thank the core team, Denis Guadri and Sara Boccini from the Accademia Teatro di Vitri, Nele Janke from Theater Hora, who was involved as a researcher as well, Pascal Grange and Silke Antres, who supported us in ethnography and camera work, and especially the amazing Sarah Marinucci. I would like to ask you for an applause as well at this point, because Sarah, she has not only been a very important partner in this research project, but she also helped to facilitate the symposium today. I would also like to thank our partners, Theater Hora and Zürichberg Foundation, especially Giancarlo Marinucci, who is here today, and who, as a director of Theater Hora, has supported the collaboration from the very beginning and made it possible at all. Yeah, and I would like to thank, of course, the Hora Ensemble, Michael Elba, and the Hora team, and Teatro Danzavile and Emanuel Rosenberg, who were involved in the Ticino sub-project and the Stage Lab. In the context of the Stage Lab, I would also like to thank Johnny Malfa and Samuel Würsten, head of the BA program in Contemporary Dance, Susanne Schneider from Beweggrund und Isabella Spirik from Mikrokulturprozent in Tech Art for the support and commitment in every respect. I would, of course, like to thank the sponsors, the Swiss National Science Foundation, the Federal Office for the Equality of People with Disabilities, Corimbo, and the Erkli Foundation, the Swiss Academy for Humanities and Social Science, which made this symposium possible, and the Swiss Association for Theater Studies or Schweizerische Gesellschaft für Theaterkultur. I cannot name all the other people involved whose names were shown on the screen earlier, but I would like to thank them all a lot for their contribution to this project. So, just a few words about the program. Can you maybe switch to the next? Yeah, tonight, after the keynote, which I'm going to introduce in a bit, we will see two artistic results from the research project. First, the mentioned Stage Lab performance by the dancers in the Kaskadenhalle, and afterwards you are cordially invited to a reception with food and drinks in front of the cinema here in the Toni Areal. At 8 p.m., you will have the chance to see our documentary film about directors with cognitive disabilities that was made as part of our sub-project with Theater Hora. Tomorrow morning, we are starting at 9 a.m., which is quite early, I know, with two panels on different sub-studies of the Disability on Stage project. The first one by our colleagues Sara Boccini and Denis Guadri from Accademia Teatro di Vitri in Verso, and the other one is about our collaboration with Theater Hora. In the afternoon, there will be 3 different parallel workshops for which you could register. In the conference folder, you will find cards of different colors, and these are the tickets for the workshop, but we will explain it again tomorrow. Yeah, and at the end, there will be a panel discussion moderated by Susanne Schneider from Beweggrund with our so-called participant observers. So I would like to welcome Margaret Ames from Aberystwyth University in Wales, Dave Calvert from Huddersfield University in the UK, and Nina Mühlemann from Zurich. These are 3 international experts in the field of performance and disability and so-called critical friends of our research project, I would say. And they have been invited to participate in this symposium. And at the end, they will wrap up or formulate some thoughts from their perspectives and yeah, based on their experiences during the past 2 days. And afterwards, we will again invite you to end the day with us with an apéro. So we like it. This is something that is very, for the people who are not from Switzerland, we like apéros very much. Yeah. And finally, a few organizational things. First of all, translation communication. As you might have already noticed, an important point of this symposium, as in our project, are the different languages and communication in general. Today's keynote speech will be in English, as announced, and the film later will be subtitled in German and English. There is a version with audio descriptions available, and we are happy to share the link with you on request. Tomorrow, the contributions will be, as you have seen in the program, in Italian and German, and the final podium will be in English. We have decided to have the lecturers and podiums translated simultaneously. And this is something new that we are trying for the first time here in this context, because you will receive the translation on your mobile phones tomorrow with headphones, or you can borrow tablets from us tomorrow morning. But we have already sent you the instructions in advance, but of course we will explain it tomorrow and make sure that everybody is set up. The Italian and German contributions will be translated into English, and the English contributions into German. During the workshops, there will be no simultaneous translations in the afternoon, but there will be people present who can help to translate. And I think most of all, language does not play the main role during these workshops. Accessibility. Yeah, we have tried to make the symposium as accessible as possible. And yeah, the rooms are all wheelchair accessible, and tomorrow there will be a sign language interpreter during one of the workshops on request. And yeah, but please, it's very important, ask if you do not understand anything, because yeah, as I said, we are all talking in different languages. And we have one person here, Anne Leichthus, who is also an expert in simple language. And yeah, and it is also worth mentioning that we have a relaxation room or a quiet space, which is located in the Cascadi foyer. And in general, feel free to take a break if you like and leave the room and come back. We have also some yoga mats here, but just yeah, feel free to, yeah, we just want to make sure that you feel comfortable. Assistance. If you have any questions or if you need assistance, not only to find the relaxation room in the Cascadi foyer, etc., we have 3 amazing students assistants here who are happy to help you and who you can contact at any time, and they will also guide us to the different rooms and studios in the next 2 days. Maybe, are you in the room? So Michelle, Sora and Jemima, maybe you can just say hi. Yeah, so tomorrow they will wear t-shirts in different colors. Yeah, related to the workshop, so yeah, you will recognize them. Documentation. As you all have heard already, because we informed you in advance, the keynote today will be recorded and it will be available. There will be a live streaming that we have sent you already the link to our YouTube channel. We have posted it on our blog and our Facebook page. Yeah, in order to make the keynote also accessible to those who cannot physically be present today. And this is also why we have set up cameras here. The documentation of the symposium will also be part of our hybrid media publication of the project that we are currently working on. So there will be photographers and camera women, etc. Just yeah, to let you know. Last but not least, the book table. As Paola Giladi has already announced, you have the possibility to buy books during the symposium at our book table. The one book is the Nemo series, the issue about Theater Horror, which is in 4 different languages, so English, German, French, and Italian. And also the Jubilee volume of Nemos is also available at the book desk. And we also have a publication about our institute, about the Institute of the Performing Arts and Film, that was founded in 2007 and in 2017. we released a publication about our research projects that we have done in the past 10 years. And you can buy these books for a special, there's a special price. And the books will be sold today during the reception in front of the cinema, and tomorrow during the apéro at the end of the event. But if you are interested in the book, you can also ask us or one of the assistants, and yeah, we will make sure that we have enough. Okay, now I have talked a lot. I'm now very pleased to introduce the amazing Carrie Sandel to you. She came to us from Chicago, where she is a professor at the University of Illinois in the Department of Disability and Human Development. Carrie, and I'm sure many of you know of her work, I would say she is one of the world's most important scholars in the field of performance and disabilities. She is head of the program on disability, art, culture, and humanities that supports the development of disability arts and culture through festivals, advocacy, and an artist residency program. Her research and creative activity focus on disability identity in live performance and film. Carrie's publications include a co-edited anthology called Bodies in Commotion, Disability and Performance, which was a milestone that had and still has an impact on scholars from all over the world. And currently she's working on a film project called Code of the Freaks that is coming out sometime soon. Yeah, this summer, she told me yesterday. Yeah, and 7 years ago, I had the privilege to be a fellow in her program in Chicago, and it makes me personally very happy that I had the chance to invite you to Zurich and that you can be here with us. And when we invited you to this keynote, to the symposium as a keynote speaker, we asked you nothing less than what would be the introduction for a new edition of Bodies in Commotion in 2019. Yeah, welcome, Carrie Sandel, and thanks.
It was like the choreography of moving up in space and getting in and out of the wheelchair. Like it's a good model for what we'll be talking about today. All right, thank you. All right, first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. I am so happy to be here. And I think the thing that strikes me most about even just arriving today is how many of you I already know. And I think that this is a testament to the growth of disability art and culture and how many times we've been able to cross paths internationally. And I think that's fitting for the topic that I've been asked to speak about today, because Yvonne and I hatched this plan in September on a bus ride, and she wanted me to talk about what the state of the field is. And so there's a lot of things I want to say, and I'm trying to keep my comments manageable. But I think that it's so interesting how networks of individuals really all over the world have developed these ideas together. So a lot of the work that I'm talking about today has issues and ideas that are happening simultaneously around the world, though I'm going to focus on Chicago examples because they're ones that I know best. But it also strikes me how many of the things I'm talking about today are merged in conversations with a lot of you or seeing your work. So that's exciting. All right. So I want to talk about the plan for this presentation. I want to organize the comments around a central question. And the central question is, What value do we find in disability, and how can the commotion our presence creates fuel the development of our movement? So the basis of the book Bodies in Commotion was the idea that whenever a disabled person enters a theater performance space, we necessarily change the space. We necessarily change the art form. So even just adding the ramp to the stage changed the ramp. I'm speaking from a table instead of using the podium. That anytime we're around, we're moving chairs around, we're creating change. And so I've started to think about how disability affects the arts in general, not as much through the concepts of access and accommodation. Those are very important. But instead, what happens when we center disability? What happens when we think about starting with the disabled body, mind, and senses? What can we generate from that unique space? I think that what tends to happen, at least in the United States, is the idea that disabled people should be provided access so that we can be included. And that's a different sort of model because that's adapting the non-disabled world to us. And when that happens, normalcy is still maintained. It's adjusted just a bit to allow us to participate, but we have so much more to offer. And that is what I'm focusing on today, is what happens when disability experience becomes the center. So in my work, I have a guiding definition of disability art and culture that's become my compass. And I want to go through that today. And then I want to talk about what has changed since Bodies in Commotion came out, which was in 2005. And then I want to explore this mythic new book that perhaps I'll be able to put together, a new Bodies in Commotion. What would some of the grounding ideas be for the new project? So Bodies in Commotion was published in 2005. And at that time, it was the first anthology that brought disability studies and performance studies into sustained conversation. And our goal at that time was to survey the field. And we asked each author to focus on a specific issue that would be generative in the field and get people thinking. And there were contributions from the fields of performance studies, social sciences, and dance. And the project actually began in 1995, but as you know, it takes a long time to put something like this together. And that started at a conference that was called This Ability, which was in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Have any of you seen the film Vital Signs? The film Vital Signs, if you look it up, it's now on YouTube, was a documentary that came out of that conference. But that conference was an important gathering spot, just as this one is today, that when we, this was the first conference in the United States where disabled artists in a disability-led organization came together and we discovered each other. It was actually a very important and transformative event for me because I had never, in all my theater training, met any other artist with a disability, especially a theater artist. And to get to meet people, it really transformed my whole career. It transformed the things I think about. And it's so important that gatherings like this exist. So those ideas started percolating. I worked with Philip Auslander, who's was a more senior scholar than I in theater studies. So he didn't have a background in disability studies, but he served as the mentor to the project. And the editing took a lot of time because we literally were introducing people to the field. So people were interested and we'd say, oh, read this, read that. And we were having to create like a syllabus or a reading list for the scholars who contributed. And so it really emerged through a very long time span. And we also tried to retain the specificities of the contributing fields. So people use different language to describe disability. They conceptualize disability differently. people coming from different disciplines write differently. So we were trying to retain the commotion of those different perspectives. And sometimes they were contradictory. So if you take a look at the book, you might find that if one article might seem to have ideas that are antithetical to the basis of another article. And that was, we thought, very productive at the time. And here was how the table of contents broke down. The first part was we called taxonomies, and we were trying to define how deaf and disability performances were emerging. What were the defining qualities? So the articles in that section addressed that issue. Then we took up the question of aesthetics. What aesthetics were emerging and how were audiences receiving them? And how was this changing the public space? Then in part 3, we pulled together articles that specifically were, I thought this was clever at the time, rehabilitating the medical model, because that was a very key focus of a lot of work, was asking us to think differently about disability and challenging the medical model. Then we took the lens out bigger to performance studies focus on more like the performance of everyday life. And then finally, we brought the focus back in to dramatic literature. And we were asking scholars to go to performance texts and to read disability critically within the texts. So that was kind of the lay of the land in 2005, going back to 1995. So what has happened in that time span? Well, first of all, disability studies as an academic field has taken hold in the humanities. And finally, the arts have joined the conversation. And the arts only really joined the conversation in the mid to late 90s. So it's starting to take hold. But still, the arts, I think, is the last to the conversation, and we still have so much to do. The disability art and culture movement, as I mentioned earlier, is international, and there are different parts of the world have their own flavor of what disability art and culture is, and that's been interesting to see how people think differently, how disability is so situated culturally, relating to social policy and people with disabilities, to cultural beliefs, religious beliefs. But nevertheless, and on all continents, you're seeing, well, I'm not sure about Antarctica, but I can claim it, why not? Somebody needs to do the work in Antarctica. But I'm seeing work happening on all continents and hearing about this. So that is exciting. And in my personal work, I moved from a focus on theater to a focus on building capacity across the arts to develop the Professional Artists with Disabilities Network. So when I was working on Bodies in Commotion, I was a theater professor for 11 years at Florida State, very much within a theater framework. Then when I moved to Chicago, I joined a disability and human development department with a PhD program in disability studies. And then I was out of the theater box, and I found myself having the opportunity to think about disability arts outside of theater, and that has definitely informed my practice. It has been transformational in that in theater studies in the United States, there are still very, very few people with disabilities who are trained as performers and academics. So it was so small that it was important actually to get out of the theater because I had so few colleagues in the theater. And ironically, I have had way more impact on the theater since I'm out of the theater than I did when I was in the theater. So that was a lesson I learned, is sometimes you have to leave something to have an impact. So that's been interesting. And at UIC, I direct a program that's citywide in the city of Chicago. It's called Bodies of Work, a network of disability art and culture. And that is an organization that's a consortium of artists and arts organizations that support the development of disability art and culture. And that network presents the work of artists with disabilities and also serves as curatorial support. And we do lots of projects together. And then the artist residency program that Yvonne mentioned, where I'm going to be pulling my examples today has become the focus of my work. The artist residency program is like my lab, where we organize the projects around what I'm called representational conundrums, which I'll get to in a moment. And so this new anthology that I would imagine would be organized around more specific representational conundrums that we just weren't ready to articulate in 2005. And I think are now starting to crystallize. I'm seeing these concerns across fields. Let me tell you the mission of Bodies of Work, because that is a guidance to me, that there needs to be, at least I find, some sort of compass for yourself to know how you're going to assess the way that you are thinking and what kind of commotion disability can create. Oh no, now it started that animation again. There was on automatic animation and I'm not sure why it's doing that, but it's commotion. Oh yeah, I planned it that way. It's performance art. So Bodies of Work is a network of artists and organizations, and it's a catalyst for disability arts and culture that illuminate the disability experience in new and unexpected ways. So in that definition, the new and the unexpected are the key terms, that we are very specifically looking for work that doesn't reinforce tragedy, doesn't reinforce the inspirational narrative, is not medicalizing. So we really are looking for new ways of thinking and expressing the disability experience. We came up with this guiding definition, and it looks so simple and lovely here on the slide, but this was a result of a lot of debate and a lot of discussion. And these are the key elements that we've decided to use in our practice. So the first one is that it refers to the creative work by people with disabilities that reflects a disability experience, either in content or form. So about this aspect of the definition, people often ask if to us, disability art means the work has to be quote unquote about disability, whether it has to be explicitly talking about the disability experience. And for us, it doesn't need to be, it can, but also we're interested in artists who want to talk about how the particularities of their bodies, minds, and senses influence form. So for instance, working with an artist who uses a mouth brush because she can't use her hands to paint. The brush strokes that she creates on the canvas are going to be different than the brush strokes of somebody who's using their hands. We are interested in people who want to really explore what that difference is. So that is how, and then also dance is a clear example. If you are, for instance, teaching a ballet class and you have a student with a wheelchair show up, it's automatically going to change ballet. There's no two ways about that. But it might not necessarily create a dance about disability. So that is something that we find interesting, that relationship between content and form. It can also include non-disabled allies whose work explores the disability experience. And it's also found in all artistic media. And we're very interested in wherever we see disability popping up in the arts, from the performing arts to literature, visual arts, comic books, film, design. And importantly, for us, for Bodies of Work to be involved with the artwork or the project, it needs to be shown in accessible spaces with accommodations in place. And also the work should be created for disability audiences as well as those in the mainstream. And so we are looking for work that assumes that there are people with disabilities in the audience. And this is something I've seen develop in the US over the past 20 years. Early on, we saw a lot of work that assumed that the audience was not disabled. And so there was a lot of explaining going on, a lot of consciousness raising. And while that is certainly important, we have gotten to the point where, how should I put this nicely? We stopped caring about the audience. Yeah, we stopped caring about whether people would get it or not, because it was really holding us back in a lot of our conversations. Some of the things that we're doing might not be legible to certain non-disabled communities. And we want to be able to advance the work. And when people with disabilities, artists, and our allies get together, the work advances so exponentially when we stop worrying about whether the audience is going to get it or not. And what I found is that audiences do catch up. You need to challenge audiences. All right. And then disability culture. What's disability culture? For us, it is really bound up with disability art. That disability art is considered an integral aspect of both the disability civil rights movement and disability culture, or the self-consciously created community of diverse disabled people in terms of impairment type, race, class, gender, and sexuality, who nevertheless share certain experiences, values, or perspectives. Now, in this definition, the key word for me is self-consciously created. That disability culture exists because we say it does. We've had people challenge us on whether disability culture exists, and we say, well, we say it does. I don't know how you can really argue with that, but it's people do, anthropologists and some others have challenged us, but it's really about us coming together and figuring out who we are. In the United States, the Americans with Disabilities Act and other civil rights legislation began when people from diverse impairment groups came together and identified as a minority. But if you think about it, people with who use wheelchairs and people who are blind might not have that much in common, that we don't necessarily have things in common, and that disability culture is a way for us to figure out what it means to be in the same group. And I see the disability art functioning in that way. And that disability art across media shares themes that have helped shape disability culture. So these are some of the themes that I've identified that I see running throughout disability art and culture in the US, but also in much of the work that you all are doing here. First of all, a lot of it engages with political issues that are relevant to people with disabilities. So I know I said that the work doesn't always have to be about disability, but a lot of it is. A lot of it is directly challenging social norms. It's directly addressing barriers and issues of importance to us. You'll also see a challenge to stereotypes. And I think earlier on in the disability art movement, you saw a lot of work that pointed out the ableism in mainstream culture. And what has happened is that work has become a lot more sophisticated, because once you point out what the stereotypes are, it's kind of like, well, where else is there to go with that, right? Stereotypes are bad. Okay, now what? It doesn't take that long to make that argument. So what we're seeing now in disability art is people using those stereotypes to turn them on their end, or to create work that specifically is a counter to those stereotypes in the work itself. So it's kind of meta. So for instance, in the film that I've been working on, Code of the Freaks, one of the things that we've challenged in the way that we've structured the documentary is how Hollywood typically represents us. Typically, Hollywood presents one disabled person per movie. And that one disabled person teaches non-disabled people valuable lessons about how they should be better people, right? And we don't do that. We're kind of snarky. We have people from different impairment groups, different identity groups, and we are feisty and we don't agree with each other. And so we are in the film showing disability culture in action in the form of the movie as much as we are critiquing Hollywood. So we're hoping that it is in itself an alternative. Another is focused on the lived experience of disability. There are aspects of our lives that the mainstream culture is not aware of, that there are values, there are experiences that need to be brought to the fore, that are interesting in and of themselves, and that can serve as models for some changes we would like to see, especially in the American context of rugged individualism, pull yourself up by the bootstrap. Disability culture is very different. And then also a development of alternative aesthetics that are based on the particularities of the bodies, minds, senses of people with disabilities. So now to the idea of the representational conundrum. So as I've gotten deeper into this work, I have found that it's, in Bodies in Commotion, I did a lot of defining, kind of like I just did now. But what I'm moving more to is getting to places where there isn't a definition, things that are confusing. So a representational conundrum is a term that I coined to describe challenging, puzzling, or paradoxical issues that are unique to or complicated by disability's presence. So there are some issues that arise in disability culture or in disability art for which there are no answers, for which they are frustratingly complicated. For instance, we could talk about competing accommodations. So in disability culture, we often find ourselves in the situation where an accommodation for one impairment group actually makes something inaccessible to another group. For instance, you may have someone who has severe allergies to dogs and someone that needs their service dog present. Or you might have differences in lighting. I had an event recently where a panel was in front of lights like these, and the way that the lights were hitting the presenters was triggering a migraine in one of the presenters, but we couldn't turn the lights down because then people couldn't see the interpreter. So we're always finding ourselves in these situations, and what I love about disability culture is we don't just say, oh, well, this is just too much of a pain in the neck, can't figure it out, those disabled people are whiny, they always complain, this is impossible. Instead, we figure out ways to make things work, and it's never perfect. And sometimes my students get frustrated when we hold events and we plan, and there's always something that goes wrong, sometimes spectacularly wrong. But it's part of what disability culture is, the commitment to try, the commitment to figure out a way to make things work. That's how disabled people live their lives. We make do, we make things work. And that's one of the qualities that we can bring to the arts. So what I do is I think about these issues because they're so generative in the way that disability is. Disability can't be cured. Disability can't ever really be solved. You can never really figure it out, but it is that very commotion that is the most generative. So now, instead of going to things that I can define, I go to things I can't define and find what can happen when you focus on the paradox or the undefinable. So I'm going to lay some of these out for you that have come up in the 3 Arts Residency Fellowship that I have at UIC. It is funded by an organization called 3 Arts, which is a foundation that funds and supports the work of women artists, artists of color, and artists with disabilities. And I work with 2 artists a year who are interested in participating in disability culture. And we organize a project. We get money, unrestricted pretty much, from 3 Arts, and then we get to figure out what we want to do with it. And we define a project together. We use the resources of the university. We work with cultural institutions in Chicago, and we work with activists, and we move the resources through those spaces to develop the next step that an artist identifies in their career. So some of these, if we were to do a reboot of Bodies in Commotion, these are some of the chapters I would consider. So the first one would be thinking about intersectionality, intermedia, and inter-impairment collaborations. And I'm going to show you some examples of what these would look like. So in intersectionality, I'm talking about how our identities form a multiplicity, and that they are unique depending on the various configurations that identity takes. So it'll become clearer, I hope, when I show you the examples. The aesthetics of access and accommodation, ethical collaborations, the repurposing of history, communicating disability phenomenology, and training and infrastructure for artists. I'll go through each one and explain what is puzzling about each one, productively puzzling. So let's start with the first one, intersectionality, intermedia, interparent collaboration. How can a simultaneous focus on difference and sameness generate new aesthetic possibilities? So clearly that's a conundrum because you can't be focusing on the same and the different at the same time because they're mutually exclusive. But what happens when we purposely toggle between sameness and difference? And when we let the tensions, instead of coming together and saying we're all the same, which you'll see in a lot of disability art, I think previous iterations, you'll say, well, we're all really human. Or we're all, despite disability, we're really all the same underneath. That is okay on a certain level, but we really aren't the same, hence disability, right? And what happens when we kind of move beyond those platitudes and really explore what's difficult and different? And these also come up with other aspects of our identity. So sometimes race in the United States, in Chicago especially, we have different experiences based on race, class, gender, sexuality. Impairment type is a big one. There are certain impairment groups that have not received some of the privileges that others have. So how do we work together? Age and also artistic medium. So the first project I want to discuss is was one centered around the residency of Baraka de Soleil. And I just saw he's going to be doing a workshop in Berlin, right?
Yes,
so in June.
Yeah.
So he worked on a project called What the Body Knows. And he specifically worked with a young dancer from New York whose name is Jerron Herman. And Barak is middle-aged. Jerron, especially at that time, was very young, in his early 20s. And he wanted to work on the transmission of knowledge of Black disabled manhood and impairment-related difference. So when Barak was working on the choreography, he invited a group of Black disabled scholars and artists and activists to a week-long residency, and it was closed. There were a couple of open rehearsals. It was even closed to me. And that's another thing. Sometimes when you're working across difference, it's not about you anymore, even if you've organized it. And that's something you have to accept. There are times when I just want to be with other disabled people. So sometimes the work isn't about you, and that has to be okay. The final product, of course, was available to everyone, but there was some synergy that happened when Black disabled folks were in the room together without others. And Jerron and Barak, they developed this piece where they were working on their samenesses and differences and how to transmit across generation Black disabled male experiences. And their bodies are also very different. And it was in the working through of the ways their bodies were different that they came up with this amazing choreography. So Barak is paraplegic, and he's mostly affected in his lower limbs. And Jerron's disability is hemiplegic, which is affecting him on one side. So you have a performer who's working with a horizontal difference and one with a vertical difference. And as they put their bodies in relation to one another, created all this incredible new movement vocabulary. Robert Schleifer is the one who's below here. He's a deaf theater artist in Chicago, and he was working on issues of translation from French to English to American Sign Language. And when he translated into American Sign Language Yasmina Reza's play Art, he then did a workshop performance with an actor, Michael Patrick Thornton, who uses a wheelchair. So again, you have this inter-impairment, 3 cultural translations to create a new version of this play. And you see some really interesting things happening, especially across deaf theater and hearing theater. And as my deaf colleagues have pointed out to me pretty insistently, is that disability culture is hearing culture. Unfortunately, the way that it has developed as hearing culture. And I've been educated very generously by a lot of my students and colleagues to understand why it's hearing culture, and they've explained to me. So it's really important that we learn from, especially groups that I'm not exactly sure in the European context, but in the US context, a lot of deaf identified artists and activists in culture, they specifically say they are not disabled. So they actively disidentify. So when you have some group actively disidentifying to the point where if we invite deaf artists to perform in our festivals, they're puzzled and they sincerely ask, well, why are you inviting us? I'm not disabled. And I'll be like, okay. But those are serious cultural differences, but they can create very dynamic work when it is a mutual collaboration. So what was happening in disability culture is deaf folks were being invited in and we'd have interpreters, but we weren't changing the hearing culture. We were just allowing them in. So what happens, what's dynamic when you really investigate the ways ableism works in disability culture itself? Okay. Now, the next one is the aesthetic of access and accommodation. And there are people all over the world working on this. How can we incorporate access and accommodations into our aesthetic to invigorate creativity in our work, eliminate barriers, and reduce cost? So disability arts folks have been trying to create new work in which accommodation is already built into the piece. So it might be working with captioning or American Sign Language or different sound options to take responsibility as a community for access ourselves, because it has been hugely difficult as we've created and produced this work, as we move from venue to venue, trying to make it accessible. We pay more on access services, for instance, in a live performance than we pay the artists. And that is a problem. So as a community, we're trying to say, how can we make access part of the piece? How can we take responsibility? And how can that inform the aesthetic? So we've been working with audio description, relaxed performance, and relaxed performances influencing aesthetics, and then also sustainability. How can it be sustained across time? So Chris Lenzo, as a dancer who's two amputated limbs, and he created a piece with choreographer Sarah Cullen Fuller called Journeyman. And the piece addressed the themes of aging, disability, memory loss, and insomnia. And I have so much I can say about all of these, but I'm focusing on the concept that we're working on called sustainable choreography. So what has happened as dancers with disabilities have moved into the dance world is that there tends to be a lot of focus on extreme athleticism, I guess we call it, or some virtuosity that some people find to be, they sometimes derisively call them tricks, focusing on tricks. Like people in wheelchairs who can do backflips, and that's all really cool. But so Chris Lenzo came to dance through being a wheelchair basketball player. And he did a lot of this very athletic work. And what has happened, then he injured his body. He injured his shoulders, he injured his neck, because the work was so demanding and injured him. So how do we age into our disabilities while creating work that is not going to injure us further? Okay, so let's see, I'm here like 5 minutes or so. Andy Slater is a blind sound artist, and he created an installation called Space for the Overactive Ear. And he created a piece that deals with stereotypes in a very creative way. He was working with, one of the things he did was he created a mock lecture, but people didn't always know that it was a mock lecture. They thought he was being serious. And he gave this lecture that he called Crypto-Acoustic Auditory Non-Hallucination. And this was a supposed discovery by a professor on how blind people had special hearing abilities that could be transmitted from outer space. And so he goes to alien those places in California that try to get messages from aliens. He records those sounds. He's done a lot of, and he's been in Australia and done this work. So he plays around with those stereotypes, but then he creates this beautiful work that he, sells as coming from outer space. And one of the things that he was, as a blind person, really wanting to do was to share this sound work with folks who were deaf or hard of hearing. And he was working with interpreters and captioners, and he has come up with some of the most creative use of metaphor that I can think of. He was like, how can I put this into language? So he would play sound bits. I'm going to give you some examples of his audio description, because he's blind, he's used to audio description. He wanted to audio describe to deaf folks. So here's one of the sounds. He said, this sounds like a robotic rhinoceros pulling a barb from its foot. And it actually did sound like that. This sounds like an old man sharing a water pipe with a cricket. This sounds like a sloth installing telephone lines onto a wooden pole. So he would come up with these amazingly descriptive descriptions of sound. Then what happened is he had these amazing descriptions of sound, and he had a sound installation in a museum on our campus, but he wanted the blind folks to have access to what he wrote. And so then he put those into a Braille book. So then it was an accommodation of an accommodation. Do you see how this can become very generative all of a sudden? So it became for everybody. So it just ended up being a very rich experience. So the next one is around the ethics of collaboration. And I think this one was very much, made me think a lot about disabled theater and the anthology that came out and the conversations that have been happening here. But as we work across our differences, what makes a collaboration ethical when our access to power, resources, and various forms of privilege differ? So as I mentioned earlier, we have differences between people with and without disabilities, differences of people with different impairment groups. We have differences of people who have institutional power. So I'm a tenured professor. I have access to things that a lot of the working artists do not. So how do the ethical issues with that? And also between activists, artists, and academics. Just to give you one example, the artist Riva Lair did a residency at UIC, and she was working on her series called The Risk Portraits. And she did this portrait of Leonard Davis, who is one of the founders of the field of disability studies, a professor at UIC. And he's also, he's hearing, but he was raised by deaf parents. So his first language is American Sign Language. And he very much identifies as CODA, or Child of Deaf Adults. In the Risk portrait, Riva very intensely collaborates with her subjects on shared vulnerability. She takes that history of the subjects, or those of us with disabilities who are represented, and tries to empower the subject. And in the Risk portrait series, she would work with her subjects to come up with a concept and an image, and she would work on the piece. And then either in her studio at home or her studio at UIC, she would leave the portrait sitter in the space, and she would go. She'd go have coffee or walk her dog or something. And the person being represented had full access to her stuff. She wanted to make herself as vulnerable as she was asking other people. So the portrait sitters at her house, they could go through her drawers. They could go through her medicine cabinet. They could take any of her art supplies and they could have a snack. They could do anything they wanted to the portrait as well. They could slash it with a knife. They could draw on it. And so what you see in this portrait is the text that Leonard Davis added to the portrait. There's in just faint lettering across the whole, behind the whole painting, like wallpaper. it says Coda, 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 the child of deaf adults. And then he has words that describe his experience and how it relates to him. So this was a very intense process, but Riva is interested in those ethics of how disabled people or people allies, as Lenny Davis is more of an ally, but the kind of vulnerabilities that we exist in. Okay, so this, I'm gonna stop with this one. This one is repurposing history, and we need to think very carefully about where we find disability in art history. This is something, especially as theater academics, that we can think about. What do we do with people from the past to make a future for disabled people? So when we go through theater history or art history, how do we frame artists with impairments? I mean, it's anachronistic to go back and frame people in ways that are not making sense in our contemporary culture. But when we have historical figures with impairments, you can think like Vincent van Gogh. How do people discuss his mental health issues in relation to his aesthetics in a way that's not sensationalizing or talking about his paintings as symptoms of mental illness? How do you really talk about the relationship between impairment experience and aesthetics? And also the evaluation of past representations of disabled characters. There's a project going on right now with the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York called Cripping the Met. And they are going through their collection and they are examining their wall texts, the stuff on their website. They're going through their archives and they're re-examining the language and the curatorial choices and finding those figures. Part of the reason why they're doing this is that disabled folks need to have role models. So if we don't mention the disability, then we can't find our predecessors. And when you do find it, then how do you frame it in a way that is going to illuminate something about the work? So Rebecca Torres is the artist I was working with last semester, and she has the project of inserting contemporary disability community into art history. So she, this one happens to be a Frida Kahlo painting in which she inserts, she's a photograph, it's a photography project where she recreates and reconstructs the costumes from images from the painting. And then this is her and her friend who both use power chairs in this iconic Frida Kahlo pose. So it's people with disabilities inhabiting and claiming those representations. And also she has, for instance, The Last Supper with all disabled folks at the table, which spawns a lot of conversations about the role of religion in disabled people's lives. Okay, so as Yvonne was talking about as well, we really need to think about the training opportunities as we build this infrastructure. I mean, it is dismal, absolutely dismal, how few people with disabilities with any kind of impairment there are in professional training programs in theater and dance. And this is a problem. One of the reasons why this persists as a problem, despite 30 years now of the Americans with Disabilities Act and the mandate to include disabled people in public education, is that there is not the training for the teachers. So one of the problems that the Kennedy Center in Washington, D.C. is working on is a convening between special education teachers and art education teachers. So they identified folks who were getting trained as special education teachers are not getting training in the arts. So they're not learning about adaptive equipment or disability or deaf cultures, things that would be relevant to disabled students, yet the disabled students are in their classes. The folks that are in art education are not getting access to special education or learning about disability. So there's this pipeline problem. There's a huge lack of students coming through the kindergarten through 12th grade program, and they're not showing up in any number. We have some very high profile people who've been successful. They're trickling in, but there's nowhere near the number of people that we need to be cast in the plays, to be And I'm sure you know in the dance world too, one of our dancers ages out or decides to stop dancing, and you have to find a dancer and train the dancer, right? They're not just coming from dance programs. And this is why that sustainable choreography is of utmost importance, because we have to protect our bodies, and we have to protect ourselves, because we're not being replaced and replenished in the numbers that one would hope that would be happening. So Ginger Lane is a current artist, and she is working on, passing on the traditions that she's developed in physically integrated dance. She's thinking about dance through the lifespan and working with younger artists and older artists in a multi-generational context. And then gatherings like this one that are vitally important. And I can't stress enough how important it is that we have this time and space to think, to enjoy each other's work, to learn through conversation. All of this is advancing, and new representational conundrums will pop up. So I invite you, as the symposium continues, that as we troubleshoot and we come up with solutions and ideas, that we also identify what those intractable problems are and maybe reframe them as generative paradoxes that we can experiment with. That is, I think, the value that disabled people can bring to the arts. So thank you so much for your attention today, and I really enjoyed sharing this work with you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Carrie, for this wonderful and thought-provoking talk. And now we have the chance to ask questions. Are you okay?
Yeah, I'm okay. I didn't know we still had time. Now I'm got this tangled up.
Yeah, but I think we still have some time left for, so 10 minutes for Q&A. We have a microphone, so we would like to ask you to use the microphone, because we are still live streamed. Okay, are there any questions or comments in the room? You can also ask in German if it's better for you, if we can translate.
Now you're so confused by the representational conundrums. You're like, I can't think anymore. It's so confusing.
Too much information? Okay.
Oh, there's a question back there.
There was a question, yeah. Okay.
Hi. Is it on? Yeah.
Yeah.
I would like to know, so you specialize on USA, but and you also talked about the American Disability Act. Do you think, or do you perceive that this American Disability Act had a consequence on how disability arts evolved? And do you observe, maybe you know about the situation and the legal situation in other countries, and if this can be an enabler or a disabler actually of the evolvement of the disability culture?
Well, I can't speak for other countries. I mean, I've had conversations, and I would love to learn more about how policy works with the development of disability art. But I have a vexed relationship with the policy. I mean, the policy is essential, and we need to have these policies for access and accommodations to education and public spaces. The problem is that the law has some very large loopholes. So one of them is that a public entity does not need to make an accommodation if it would present an undue burden. So if something is too expensive, or if something would change an architectural structure like an historic building, there's a lot of undue things that can be pointed out as an undue burden, or if it fundamentally changes the nature of a program. So in my example of ballet, if you wanted to preserve ballet in its unique form and you started to be required to, train wheelchair users, you could say that fundamentally alters the nature of my program. So what has happened is that there are many arts organizations that will find those loopholes and then do nothing. And they'll say, sorry, we can't do anything. And so what I've been arguing for is that we are undue burdens and that is our strength, and that we should ask for unreasonable accommodations, because reason itself is an ableist concept, and that we need to be thinking about how we can change things up. And what I have found is that the policy route and going and insisting that disabled people be included doesn't always work because of the loopholes, but also because a lot of organizations have a lack of imagination. What happens more readily is that when we create the work, and that's what my residency program is doing, and what I'm sure is happening with a lot of your spaces, then mainstream spaces say, I want that. They'll say, oh, I want that piece. And then all of a sudden, things they said 3 or 4 years ago that were impossible, they somehow can do. They need to see the work. So what I'm noticing more is that the policy is good. It gives us a foothold, but what really convinces people to make changes in their programs is when they see something so engaging and innovative, they want to present it. So I'm hoping that, the ADA has also been challenged a lot in the current administration. I will leave it at that. I think you know what I'm talking about. There's someone up here.
Yeah. Thank you. Hi. You mentioned before that the arts were very late in joining the discussions, and maybe you said why, and I didn't grasp, but I wonder why, because as art is something seeking inspiration, and is something that I experience at least as a very open space for expression and variety and diversity. And it really shocked me to hear that we, or the arts, were the latest.
Well, yeah, they were late to the discussion of disability studies as an academic discipline. I think that is because the arts are one of the most inaccessible and inhospitable places for disabled people. There's the lack of training programs. There is curriculum that is ableist in its very nature. There are also very few academics who are in the PhD programs who have disabilities, and that's still true. And so the arts, so a lot of us are practitioner scholars, and I think that it took more time for the practitioner scholars to begin to develop the critical language. There was work around therapy, dance therapy, art therapy, drama therapy, but disability as an aesthetic is further behind. But it's starting to enter the picture more. I think that we're going to see it a lot more, especially as the visibility of the work that is happening, especially here in Europe. You have so many amazing festivals and companies that we don't have at all in the United States. I think it's just gaining more visibility and like this whole grant-funded project. So hopefully it will pick up. So I'm going to make the case now for that Bodies in Commotion reboot.
Yeah, there are 2 more questions, I think. You and Nina. Yeah.
Thank you for your presentation, Carrie. So you summarized the last 20 years, and you've been jointly at different conferences that should have marked the end of all conferences, trying to get training, trying to get access to theaters. There are all these wonderful initiatives, and I mean, there was a real boost in the 90s where it was like legislation, there was artwork happening, but like, well, we've arrived somewhere. But is it really moving?
Yeah.
Or are we still running against the same walls? And what keeps you going in it? That you, it means it's like a lifetime achievement eventually, or a lifetime endeavor to make it happen.
This is such a painful question. What has been happening is there have been some intense collaborations and intense interventions. And what I have noticed is so bodies of work, we work with various arts organizations, and sometimes people leave those organizations who have been our primary champions or collaborators, and the next thing you know, everything we did is completely gone. And despite the law, despite the popularity of initiatives, so I'm seeing that happen, and there's too few of us to keep, especially as things keep proliferating, you can't keep track. So that's something to be mindful of, is how often spaces that have created change very quickly revert back when the spotlight shifts. So I'm frustrated by that. And there has also been a tremendous campaign by disability activists in the US, and I've seen it on Facebook coming from my friends who are here posting, in the theater to cast disabled actors for disabled roles. And the activists have gotten a lot of attention for this campaign. The problem is, and I've just completed some research on actor training and disability, is that there are so few trained disabled actors that there is no way that we could fill those roles if we cast traditionally, like the right age, the right gender, the right, ethnicity or race. Because you start to go down, casting is so specific, especially in film, that if you're doing films and you're trying to find the right person, it's just not going to happen. So it's like the activism is 2 steps ahead of the academy. And so hopefully that attention, the activists are always ahead, but hopefully that attention will help to push training programs further. But what I've been advocating for is for theater companies to look for the trained artists that are in their community and to choose work that makes use of those talents. Because I get a lot of phone calls from people wanting me to help them find, they'll say, I want a Latina woman who is 25, who has a mobility impairment, and they'll just keep going on. And I'm like, okay, maybe that person's in California, but they want things that are so specific, and that is just, it makes it impossible. So maybe that's something that we can all think about, is making use of the disabled talent that we have locally instead of trying to find people, because then that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Then those companies say, well, we tried to cast a disabled performer, they just don't exist. So yeah, that's a couple of responses.
Okay, one last question, maybe Nina, you wanted. Yeah.
Yes, thank you so much for this amazing lecture. It really had a profound impact on me. And I just wanted to know, so with all these projects that you're at the moment working on, I guess, are these conundrums? Where do you think this is headed, or is there some kind of final project around those where maybe those questions can come together?
Well, I've been publishing and bringing these up and articulating them and offering examples to people, hoping that they'll be generative in those ways. Hopefully I'll come up with a new anthology. But one of the reasons why I'm promoting this idea is because I have heard a lot of people, this goes back to Jörg's question, giving up. Like, it's just too hard. Deaf theater and disability theater, we just can't come to any agreement on who we are, if we're disabled or not. Or people will give up when they say, oh, competing accommodations, we just can't do it. There's people are using these conundrums not as moments of possibility, but as moments of defeat or as excuses not to continue. And it goes along with what I was saying too, with companies that when you stop paying attention to them, they revert back to their old ways because it's hard. Work is hard and it's also painful. So when I talked about Barak's week residency that I was not invited to, that was painful. But you have to be in there with the pain as well as the fun, and you have to be in there and recognize that it's not all about you. And we have to work, especially on generational legacy. This really struck me because I turned 50 this year, and in Crip years that's like 78. So like dog years. So, and I have chronic pain issues and I'm tired, right? And so I've really been cultivating my students and I've been passing them out. All right, student X, you work on this conundrum. You work on that one. I'm really hoping that the young people take these questions up and continue to think about them as opportunities because they're not going to be solved. That was kind of like the light bulb that went off for me. It's like, we're not going to solve these problems. And that has to be something that we hold on to with hope rather than despair.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much again, Carrie. It has been wonderful.
Big thank you to you, Carrie, for this wonderful lecture keynote today. And at this point, I would like to introduce you to the next program item, namely the premiere of the so-called StageLab 2.0. As Yvonne Schmidt and Anthony already mentioned in the introduction, the realization of an inclusive stage laboratory was finally entered in the curriculum of the Bachelor Contemporary Dance, due to the experience gained within the framework of our research project. And the module is held every 2 years. It's the plan. And the result of this first session, artistically directed by Emanuel Rosenberg from Teatro Danzabile, will be shown in a few moments in the Kaskadenhalle. And I'm very delighted to invite you to the show on Unvorhersehbare Fähigkeiten. That's the title, Unforeseen Abilities of the Bachelor Contemporary Dance in collaboration with Teatro Danzabile. So its performance, the duration is almost 20 minutes. Now in German. Von mir, richtig auch. Danke vielmals, Carrie, für deinen wunderbaren Vortrag. Und an dieser Stelle möchte ich Sie gerne zu dem nächsten Programmpunkt bitten und Ihnen eine kleine Einführung geben. Und zwar geht es um die Premiere des sogenannten StageLabs 2.0. Wie Yvonne Schmidt und Anton Ray bereits in der Einführung erwähnt haben, wurde die Durchführung eines inklusiven Bühnenlabors aufgrund der Erfahrungen im Rahmen unseres Forschungsprojektes Beste Curriculum des Bachelor Contemporary Dance an der Zertifikat verankert. Das Modul wird alle 2 Jahre durchgeführt und das Resultat der ersten Durchführung, künstlerisch geleitet durch Emanuel Rosenberg vom Teatro Danzabile, werden wir in wenigen Augenblicken in der Kaskadenhalle im 5. Stock zu sehen bekommen. Und ich freue mich sehr, Sie zum Showing Unvorhersehbare Fähigkeiten des Bachelor Contemporary Dance in Kollaboration mit Teatro Danzabile einladen zu dürfen. Und ich darf Sie jetzt bitten, please follow our great helpers, students, to the Kaskadenhalle. Thank you very much.